Hey, this is Fox from Inferno Fox Gaming. So I figured it was time. I think that I should go ahead and make the plunge and do my own console tier list. And this is also something that was inspired by the Iowa Retro Gamer Dad. Again, I've mentioned him before in previous channels. He did an excellent console tier list of his own. I'm going to put a link to that in the description below. But I figured, it's my turn, and I'm going to institute a couple of rules and just FYIs. One of the biggest rules that I want to do is to only include consoles that I have played. We're not going to include anything that I haven't touched before or haven't owned or anything like that. As long as I've played it and or have owned it, then I am going to rank it. Also, another FYI rule, I'm old. Yep, I'm the old guy yelling at cloud. I've been playing video games for almost 40 years, so that means I've got a lot of experience with video games. It does not negate your personal experience with video games. Just a little FYI that I may have nostalgia goggles for some of the old consoles, and that may not apply to some of the more recent ones. Let me know your thoughts on my rankings in the comment sections below, but that's enough waffling. Let's jump right to it, and we're going to start with the Game & Watch. Gunpei Yokoi's baby, and it was Nintendo's first portable device. Yeah, I'm giving this a C tier, and I'm just giving this a C tier because each individual Game & Watch had just one game, and it really served the purpose of being able to appease the businessman on the go, to have a little something in their hands to play with. And it was just that was really it. It was pretty much useless outside of unlighted areas. Just had the one game. There was no save features. I think beyond being able to save like your high scores, I think that was the one thing that I could do, so yay there. But super duper basic, great for the time, but it has not aged that well. So again, Game & Watch is a C. And if you couldn't tell, we're going in the orders of these releasing. And the next one up is the ColecoVision. And I think this officially was the very first console I'd ever played, because I have a memory of being 2 years old and playing Arctic Adventure. This is a D tier. Just 2 years later, like the Famicom and whatnot, blew this out of the water. I mean, for its time, yeah, it was good, but there's a reason why second-generation consoles were nearly the death of the North American video game market. Thankfully, it wasn't ColecoVision itself that was the cause, but maybe it was just one of the precipitating factors. Still, the super, super basic noise-like music and everything like that. You want to talk about a system that hasn't aged well, that's the ColecoVision. Moving on to the next console, the NES. That is an A tier, because the NES was the breakout hit, yada yada, you know the story. We're going with my personal feelings on why the NES is an A. You can't beat just how fantastic this gaming library was. I mean, you of course had the Super Mario Brothers, and third parties were hitting hard with stuff like Contra, Final Fantasy, Blaster Master. I mean, they're just look at my pins here, my fantastic pins that just speak to my love for this console. Absolute A tier. Just it was the pinnacle of graphics for its time. Yes, now in retrospect, maybe we could look back on something like the Sega Master System. Maybe that was a bit better on both the graphics and the sound and everything like that, but I have not played the Master System, didn't grow up with it. It's not getting a ranking. So the NES, though, absolute killer video games and everything like that. Great accessories. It's not an S tier because of the way that it loads. I mean, the whole myth of blowing in the cartridges and it working and everything like that, and just dealing with all of that. The top loading ones were really that were real late to the game. I think it released in 92 or 93, a year or two after the Super Nintendo released. I mean, come on, that was the way to play. That would have really helped if Nintendo had released like maybe that mid generation. Didn't happen. But that being said, that was probably one of the biggest Achilles heels with the NES. Moving on to another system, and it's the mini version is going to be over my left shoulder here, the Sega Genesis. I was a Nintendo fanboy growing up. I am going to make sure you guys know that ahead of time of this ranking because Sega Genesis is an A tier. The Sega Genesis was such a fantastic system in retrospect. I mean, you want to talk about something that really, when I finally got into it, like maybe like 4 years ago, you got awesome first-gen games, obviously the Sonic games, I mean, that goes without saying. Even stuff like Phantasy Star and even and other things like Rocket Knight Adventures, Contra Hardcore, Castlevania Bloodlines, and even other stuff, like Shining Force. The Sega Genesis didn't play around. It's not an S tier not because I was a Nintendo fanboy growing up, but because of other little nitpicks that I have with it, such as the music quality not being as good as another 16-bit system that had released around a little bit later after the Genesis, as well as the fact that it did release in the late 80s. It didn't have the forethought of technology, but it was still punching over its weight class for many years to come, and really came into its own thanks, of course, to President Tom Kalinske, as well as just the great dev teams that Sega had. Yeah, Sega definitely an A tier. Moving on to the Game Boy, I feel like I'm gonna be gracious and give the Game Boy an A because it came out in 1988, 1989. Another Genpei Yokoi vehicle. He is just renowned for making excellent handhelds as well as Metroid. Nerd knowledge aside, the form factor for the Game Boy just being, what was it? 4 AA's and no backlighting and just super basic 8-bit graphics that were black and white. But man, they lasted forever, like 20 plus hours. And honestly, the game library, yeah, you had some of the the NES ports that had their own like Game Boy versions, but sometimes the Game Boy versions eclipsed the greatness that were the NES versions, such as like even games like Kid Dracula. The Game Boy version of that is known to be better than the OG NES one. Besides that, of course, you had fantastic games like the Super Mario Land series, a little known series called Pokemon, I think it was. I don't know, I didn't really get into Pokemon at the time when that came out. And that was a late blooming series. You even had stuff punching above its weight class, such as like the Donkey Kong Land series. And yeah, I mean, in retrospect, you play it now on the NSO, the graphics doesn't really hold up as well. But thinking just having Donkey Kong Country on the go for what it did, it was excellent. Then of course, you had the introduction of Kirby, and you had Kirby's Dreamlands 1 and 2, fantastic games. The games really make the system, and the Game Boy really was great with that. As I mentioned, it was black and white, sound quality, 8-bit, stuff like that. I felt like it kept it from being an S tier. I get what Nintendo was doing. They wanted to keep it low power and keep the durability up because they're marketing it to kids. They really did that, and it really has the whole durability factor. Insert the anecdote about the blown up Game Boy in the Gulf War or something like that. I've seen that in person at the Nintendo store in New York City. Cool, and it just proves the point of what Nintendo was doing with the Game Boy. The other side of that is the Game Gear, and I am giving that a C, and just be a C because of I really feel like there were so many great games that the Sega Master System had that the Game Gear, of course, was working to port, but just the screen crunch with that and the sacrifices they made with stuff like that, as well as the fact that obviously, being a battery muncher, what was it, like 6 AA's, you only get 6 hours. Yeah, it was great that it was color. It was great that, the audio was, I felt like it was better, but just didn't feel like that the game output was there as much as it was for, the Sega Genesis. And yeah, that's why I feel like it's a C. Next up is the Super Nintendo. Unfortunately, the Super Nintendo is a D tier. I am lying. Put your fingers down from that comment section. Super Nintendo is an S tier. And as Scott the Woz would say, yep, I'm one of those 40-year-olds that just loves the Super Nintendo. But hear me out, Super Nintendo was the upgrade from the OG NES. I mean, you had obviously from 8-bit to 16-bit, just the huge increase in the amount of colors, the sound quality, oh my goodness. The sound quality from the NES to the SNES, thanks in part to Nintendo's collaboration with Sony on the audio chip. I mean, just the soundtracks and everything, and the sound effects, amazing. And a lot of the OG, the early SNES games, kind of like ActRaiser and Super Adventure Island, they really sort of, not exploited, but really took advantage of that high qualities. It really, like, you can really hear it with some of the drum beats and the orchestration, everything like that. Absolutely fantastic system. Then, of course, you have obviously Donkey Kong Country in the midlife cycle will help to breathe life back in and really help to bring the fight back against not only Sega, but with Sony and the newly releasing PlayStation at the time. Really helped to keep the Super Nintendo competitive. And oh yeah, a little genre known as the RPGs. You had just banger after banger. Obviously, the three Final Fantasy games: Chrono Trigger, Super Mario RPG, Secret of Mana, Seiken Densetsu 3, or Trials of Mana, if you want to get recent American release about it. And then a whole bunch of Super Famicom RPGs that we never got here in the States. I mentioned three Final Fantasies, the one in the middle, Final Fantasy V, and then also stuff, again, Seiken Densetsu 3, Star Ocean, Live Alive, a whole bunch of other ones that I haven't even mentioned. Thankfully, we have either gotten them or either as fan translations or even as mainline releases from the companies like Square Enix. Just absolutely fantastic system. I think the only criticism that I could give for it is just the fact that I do think Sega Genesis did action games better thanks to Sega's roots with the arcades and Sega themselves being more aligned with that. I personally feel that Earthworm Jim and the Hyperstone Heist on the Sega Genesis plays better, a little bit more solid, a little bit more crunchier versus Super Nintendo versions, the latter, of course, being Turtles in Time. But just absolutely everything's fantastic with the Super. Let's move on to the PlayStation, and maybe this one's going to be the actual first hot take. I'm giving the OG PlayStation a B, because I do not have a lot of love with this generation. I do love me the RPGs from this era, but I slept hard on the overall RPGs on the PlayStation. I'm only just like getting to them now. So that means, yeah, I've played the Final Fantasy games. I mean, that's a given as a Final Fantasy nerd. Beyond that, though, Suikoden, all those kind of games, Wild Arms, never touched them and haven't yet. And that's not even accounting to the other PlayStation games that I have touched, such as Twisted Metal, Gran Turismo, and just a whole host of other PlayStation games, as well as like Siphon Filter. And, you know, those are just a big yawn for me. I don't feel like those games were a lot of fun when I was playing them at the time. And I think that's due to the fact that this was the fifth generation, was the first time that these game companies got into the whole 3D aspect of gaming. And I still will say, even to this day, that 3D games in the fifth gen have not aged very well. I feel I'm being very gracious giving the PlayStation a B with all that said, and it's thanks to the RPGs and JRPGs of the time. And let's talk about the Nintendo 64. Yeah, you're not getting off that easy. Nintendo 64 is getting a C. Again, C. Same thing with the whole 3D graphics thing, except, hey, PlayStation, they got to have CDs and put everything on CD media. Hey, 700 megabytes worth of data to be able to put on one disc. Nintendo didn't give that to themselves or the third-party companies that were working with Nintendo on that. Yeah, there is something to be said about creativity being able to spring out of a box, but that was one hell of a restricted box that Nintendo gave. And, the third-party companies, they're saying, We're not gonna deal with that if we don't have to. So Nintendo lost a lot of Capcom, lost a lot of Konami, lost all of Square Enix. All these powerhouses went to the PlayStation. But hey, Nintendo did have Brian. They did have Quest 64. In all seriousness, there were bangers. There were a great number of bangers on the Nintendo 64. But I guarantee you that you can't list for me 10 to 15 bangers that don't have one or two that you'd really have to introspect and say, hey, I've got heavy nostalgia goggles on these. And I'm the same way. There's a number of bangers on the 64 that, yeah, maybe if I take the nostalgia goggles off, maybe it didn't age as well. Gonna stay in the hot takes territory with the Game Boy Color. And I'm giving the Game Boy Color a B because, come on, Nintendo. You release an excellent handheld console that about 10 years after you release the Game Boy, and you have such a small incremental update to it. The Game Boy itself had a version that released in Japan only called the Game Boy Light that was front-lit. They made an official front-lit Game Boy system, yet you're going to release another iteration a year or two later, the Game Boy Color that isn't? And the fact that it's essentially a super-powered NES 13 years after the NES released. That's unacceptable. Yes, I know that there were Zelda games for, and yeah, I get that. Pokemon games for the Game Boy Color. Yeah, great, wonderful, but there was just a number of these NES games that got ported to the Game Boy Color, and I didn't feel that was enough to make that a great system. Great that it could, backwards compatible play a lot of the, all the Game Boy games. Wonderful, but I felt like the technology was just way too small for that time. And speaking of which, let's talk about a greater increase in technology for Nintendo's handhelds. That's going to be the Game Boy Advance. This is an A tier in my eyes. Game Boy Advance is a fantastic handheld that has a plethora of fantastic games. Not only the ones that were ported from the Super Nintendo, but you got stuff like Golden Sun, Mother 3, and even like sequels to Gunstar Heroes, which were the Gunstar Heroes, excellent game on the Sega Genesis. It gets a sequel. You got a system that, yeah, maybe it can get a little convoluted again with the whole linking system and everything like that. Linking with the GameCube here, maybe that could get a little convoluted, but whatever. Game Boy Advance, absolutely fantastic library. Loved that it could play all the Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. And the SP variant, I love that it was backlit, fantastic. The buttons and everything, the form factor didn't feel as comfortable as the OG that wasn't. And that's why Game Boy Advance is not an S tier, is because the form factors. The OG Game Boy Advance had the best form factor, but it wasn't backlit or frontlit like Nintendo did with the Game Boy Light. The Game Boy SP was backlit, fantastic, but kind of felt more scrunched in the form factor and wasn't as comfortable, and the buttons didn't feel as great as the OG Game Boy Advance. Sorry, Nintendo, you were so close to getting an S tier. You're getting an A from me. We're going to move back, though, to the console side with the 6th generation. And I feel that where the consoles sort of were in the 5th generation, they more than redeemed themselves with the 6th gen. We're going to talk about the Dreamcast, and I'm giving the Dreamcast a B. Only because Dreamcast is only getting a B simply because it didn't get enough time for its wings to soar with its games library and what Sega could have done if it had a second half of that console generation. Because a lot of consoles, like console lives, kind of have like a first half, second half, or sometimes a first, second, and third act. And there was no second act or third act or second half for the Dreamcast. And I felt like that's where you would have had some really killer games on the Dreamcast. I mean, come on, you guys got to take a look at videos such as what MVG had provided showing Grand Theft Auto 3 on the Dreamcast. Yeah, it doesn't run as smoothly as what you would see on the PS2, but it's close, and that's the power the Dreamcast could have had. And it made stuff real mainstream with things like Phantasy Star Online, online gaming. Yeah, I get that, Sega Genesis had the Sega channel, and Nintendo and the the SNES had what was it, the Satellaview, but it was a Dreamcast that really started to make online gaming like a real thing, and that needs to be recognized. Dreamcast, fantastic system. It's only getting a B because it had half of its life cut short, and we're left stuck thinking, what could have been? Let's talk about the PS2 though. PS2 fixed everything, literally everything that was wrong with the PlayStation, games wise, and then some. The PlayStation 2 is an S tier, hands down. Not only do you have like such a large library akin to what the PlayStation had, but PlayStation 2 had even more, even a greater number of games. It was a DVD player, which is a huge thing back in the time. Again, I'm old. We wanted to have DVD players, and that technology was just coming out. Sony made that easy for us. And I mean, come on, Ludacris was even bragging about his PlayStation 2 in his ride. The idea that the form factor of the controller that was great on the PlayStation continued with the PS2. You had games, again, big RPG guy, like Final Fantasy X, MMORPGs like Final Fantasy XI. Of course, you had later games like Final Fantasy XII and the Xenosaga series and Dragon Quest VIII. The RPGs on the PS2 were incredible, but that's not all. That is not all. The sports games, Madden was fantastic, and just some of the action games. I mean, God of War. I'm not a huge fan of the God of War series, but I have to admit that the God of War series looked and played fantastic, as well as I mean, I could keep going. I could keep gushing about the PS2. If you want to gush about the PS2, let me know in the comments section below. I can't think of a single negative with the PS2. Maybe you want to let me know that in the comments section. I can't think of a negative, and that's why it's an S tier. If we talk about the GameCube is an A tier. What I loved about the GameCube is the fact that it continues the Nintendo 64's tradition of having 4 slots right off the bat for 4 ports on the console. It really making games like Smash Brothers just absolutely fantastic. And it also made a lot of experiences such as Phantasy Star Online, because it had the ability to play that online. And then like stuff like the Game Boy player, it was great to have Game Boy games and Game Boy Advance games playable. It kind of harkened back to the Super Nintendo days. And just the idea that you could have really fantastic first-party Nintendo games go off the beaten path. Mario had a squirt gun. Link in the Zelda series was cel-shaded for the first time. Metroid was a first-person shooter. You didn't see that kind of stuff, and Nintendo was really willing to take risks with that. They paid for it because it was one of their least successful consoles, but it was fantastic, and I absolutely loved that about the Nintendo. So if we're continuing with the 6th generation, then we got to talk about the Xbox. And the Xbox I am giving a B because the Xbox just felt like a very, 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 very slightly more powerful version of the PS2 with honestly a more reliable DVD player, because I felt like what was in the PS2 was serviceable, but it didn't work. It wasn't like the best quality. Man, the Xbox's DVD player, we use that all the time. Once my roommate / best friend got his, as well as the fact that, Halo 2, absolutely fantastic games, as well as with the whole Xbox Online aspect of it, especially with like Halo 2, that was amazing. But if I'm looking back and thinking of non-Halo games, I can't really think of anything else that the PS2 didn't already do or didn't get a little bit later. So that being said, with the PlayStation 2 already being an S, the Xbox was good, but it wasn't anything that really was just, oh my goodness. Okay, yeah, so it had Fable, but I didn't really get into Fable. I wasn't really big into that. So, yeah, Xbox, it's going to be a solid B on there. And then now we're going to sort of get into the 7th generation of gaming. And this is really like my lost generation. I wasn't into single player experiences on video games as much. So I'm sort of giving you that heads up because there's not a lot of love loss that I have with this gen. And honestly, I kind of feel that right now we are in peak nostalgia for the 7th generation. Anytime you have a set of individuals, kids, you fast forward 20 years after they were kids, as adults, they look back at what they played as kids and feel like, oh, hey, those were the good times. What it's 20 years ago from, as of the recording of this video, the aughts, the 2000s, and that's where the 7th generation comes in. And I've already mentioned in a previous video about why I feel that it's possible the 7th generation is overrated. Link to that will be in the description below. And to that end, let's talk about the Nintendo DS. Yeah, I know the Nintendo DS isn't like main consoles, but it was technically 7th gen. I'm going to give the Nintendo DS an A. And this is a whole thing that Nintendo had so many different iterations of the DS. You had the Fat Boy, and then you had the DS Lite, and then you had the DSi. That kind of like mid-gen refresh sort of a thing without actually increasing the power. Yeah, you could argue maybe the DSi was a little bit more powerful, but that sacrificed the ability to play Game Boy Advance games. There was like a sort of identity crisis with the DS itself, and Nintendo was trying to build that as its third pillar to accompany the Game Boy Advance and the GameCube, and of course later the Wii. Just what Nintendo was trying to do with the hardware, again, harkening back to the Game & Watch, didn't really. I felt like they could have done that a lot better. And of course, I'm saying all this, and the DS is probably one of the most successful video game systems of all time. I get that, and that really is due to the ability for Nintendo to market to the general public in this generation. I mean, you had stuff like Brain Age, games a day to help improve your overall brain output and everything. Spoiler alert, that didn't work. And then you also had fantastic entries like New Super Mario Brothers and just maybe middling Zelda games, and maybe Metroid wasn't as great. I mean, it was great for what it was. It was a first-person, like, multiplayer sort of a game with Metroid Prime Hunters, and you can't miss out with Metroid Prime Pinball. But there were a whole bunch of other great ports and everything and remakes, such as Chrono Trigger and Fire Emblem, and just a whole bunch of other sorts of games with the DS that really brought the gaming again to the forefront to the general public. It's these games that really make the Nintendo DS an absolutely fantastic system. And Nintendo DS, solid with an A. Right, and I also have a lot of really good memories with Mario Kart DS. It's one of the finer of the Mario Kart games, and just being able to play that with 7 other people wirelessly without having to deal with the cords and cables. If let's stick with the portables. We're gonna talk about this Sony's redheaded stepchild, the PSP. I'm giving this a C because the games library, it really felt like Sony was trying to make what Nintendo did with the NES and give it to the Game Boy. Sony was really doing this with the PSP with stuff like, I think it was like Metal Gear Solid Acid or Metal Gear Acid, and again like God of War and stuff like that. Yeah, there were some good games like Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. It's a solid 7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 game. And this ended up becoming a JRPG powerhouse, but really, games library-wise in North America, I didn't feel like it was as strong, wasn't as enticing, and just like the form factor was excellent, fantastic. But having the memory stick duo for the actual memory and on that, really sort of indicative for what Sony was doing at the time. So that gets points off for that. But really wish that Sony has a habit of introducing systems and everything and just not really sticking with them. PSVR, it's stuff like that. And it's just chasing trends and trying to do their own version of it. It just wasn't as great. And speaking of not great for this generation, the PlayStation 3 is absolutely a C. PS3 is I will argue, besides the PSP, PlayStation 3 is the worst of the PlayStation consoles. From sepia tone games, again, I know that was for the main color for the time, because the other consoles on the 7th gen did that, to the ridiculously priced $600 console that Sony really wanted to have everything in the kitchen sink with it. Yeah, I get that it was great that it had Blu-ray within it. You know, that was really something in 2006, you know, for the time, as well as, you know, being able to backwards compat both PS1 and PS2 games. Yeah, they got rid of the PS2 compatibility very quickly on future iterations of the system. I didn't forget that, and that's why it's losing letters. Not to mention the fact that some of Sony's biggest foibles occurred during the PS3 era. You had stuff such as the PlayStation Network down and the hack that I was a victim of, and I ended up paying the price for years and years later. And you also had just a whole host of like other issues with that system. Again, check out my Is the 7th Generation Overrated video. I feel that the PS3 didn't really come into its own until its Act 2. If it didn't have an Act 2 like the Dreamcast, the PS3 would be a D tier. And it really started with games like Uncharted and Infamous and everything like that. Just really being able to finally, hey, here's how you develop for the PS3. Because that was another thing. The cell processor, the PS3 was notorious for being difficult to develop for. You want to know what wasn't difficult to develop for, and that would be the Xbox 360. And that the Xbox 360 is an A tier. The only reason the 360 is not an S is the Red Ring of Death. And I'm really sorry, Xbox fans. I do feel that merits a letter grade down from an S, because, oh man, I know a number of people who really got burned with the Red Ring of Death. Huge kudos to Microsoft for being able to rectify the situation and spend over $2 billion in doing so. So thank you, Microsoft, for focusing on QA and figuring out what the problem was, as well as the fact that releasing future iterations that were excellent. The Xbox 360 Elite systems, they were fantastic. Just being able to iterate, and that mid-generation time period where they were able to really innovate with Xbox Live and make online gaming, you know, that much better. And just remember the Halo 3, I know that was early. That was earlier in the 360 lifetime, but just Halo 3, Halo Reach, a whole bunch of the online gameplay. And then you have all the fantastic games on the 360 that really came into their own. Again, RPG guy, Lost Odyssey, Blue Dragon, and then fantastic games like Need for Speed and Batman Arkham Asylum, BioShock, just a whole bunch of, just a whole plethora of fantastic games that were on the 360. To me, that was the best system in the 7th generation. But it didn't sell the most. That would be the Wii. And the Wii, I am going to be very nice and give it a B. Wii is B tier. Even if it is an overclocked GameCube with the gimmicky motion controls, Nintendo did a fantastic job of not only marketing it, but selling it to the general public with games like Wii Sports. Great that was the case, because Grandma and Grandpa's playing it, but I feel like the Wii's attach rate for that wasn't as good, because once you had Wii Sports, that's really all that Grandma and Grandpa need. It's really all the general public needs. Not to say there weren't excellent games on the Wii, with, again, being an overclocked GameCube, because there's only so many games from the 7th generation that could go to that, but you still had classics, obviously, like Project Rainfall and Xenoblade Chronicles, and the masterpieces that are Super Mario Galaxies 1 and 2, Twilight Princess, as well as Skyward Sword. I still argue that the GameCube version of Twilight Princess is better, because I am not a fan of motion controls. And I also appreciated the fact that, hey, you can play all the GameCube games on there. So that's a credit to the GameCube library that you could still play on the Wii. The last versions, like the last one or two versions of the Wii, got rid of the GameCube backwards compatibility. But I mean, hey, most people had the first few versions of the Wii that could still play them if they still wanted to. And of course, the Wii introduced the Virtual Console, so it was great to be able to play some of the old classics again, because unfortunately, my Nintendo library and Super Nintendo library had already come and gone, thanks to my older brother, whom had sold those a long time ago. It's great to play those again in a legal manner. Let's move on, though, to the 8th generation of gaming. And we're going to talk about our friend, the Nintendo 3DS. I am begrudgingly going to give the 3DS an A. I hate the 3DS's circle joystick. I hate it. I'm still hoping that the creators of the Analog Pocket do a version that plays Nintendo 3DS and Nintendo DS games and has a fully functional joystick, because I hate that circle joystick. It makes games, decent games like Super Mario 3D Land, to great games like the Smash Brothers for the 3DS, just kind of a pain to play. But really what makes the 3DS so fantastic is it takes the DSiWare system from the last iteration of the DS and expands on it, and has the Nintendo eShop, has the Virtual Console. It had the Ambassador program if you were dumb enough to buy the 3DS at full price when it first came out, because then, hey, you got a whole bunch of Game Boy Advance and Nintendo games for free. That's cool, but then you could also play most of those. Now, I don't think the Game Boy Advance had a Virtual Console part, but you could play most of those on the 3DS. And of course, yeah, it had a new 3DS, not ranking that because I didn't have the new 3DS. I kind of felt like that was a little crappy, especially because it was like, the last 2 or 3 years of its lifetime. And then you got crap like the new 2DS, and you got the little Junior's first version of the 2DS. And I do love the XL versions of the 3DS. I kind of wonder why they didn't do that with the Switch, but maybe because there literally is a fidelity downgrade whenever the Switch is taken off the dock. Whatever. I cannot emphasize, though, how fantastic the 3DS library is. I mean, JRPGs were banger after banger. A surprising lack of mainline entry for Final Fantasy Square. I get that we got, what was that? Final Fantasy Explorers or World of Final Fantasy, whatever that Bojazz was. Great, we got Dragon Quest 7 and 8. It would have been great if we had a new mainline Dragon Quest game. Okay, I know Dragon Quest 11 released, but that was in Japan only for the 3DS. Just a whole bunch of great games. Atlas was just making banger after banger, because you had like Shin Megami Tensei 4 and 4 Apocalypse. There was like the Etrian Odyssey games. Kirby, Planet Robobot. Metroid remake of Metroid 2. That was a fantastic game that I honestly think should have been on the Switch, but 3DS itself, great system. That circle joystick is bumping it down from an S to an A. But yeah, and I do want to take a moment here and shout out all of the Nintendo systems again for, they sort of downgrade on the power level, with the horsepower of the processors, but the battery life, man, they nail it on all of their portable devices. Because the 3DS, I felt like I could get 20 hours of gameplay. The DS was like 25. The PSP was like, honestly, that PSP was pretty good, 10, 15 hours. And obviously PSP is a Sony device, but they were really doing a good job in the aughts and later for all the portable devices. And Nintendo, man, they knew how to do it since the Game & Watch days. I mean, if we're being honest. And moving on with another 8th entry, let's stick with Nintendo for a second, and we're going to talk about the banger that is the Wii U. Yeah, the Wii U. That's a C tier, because fantastic games like Super Mario 3D World, but the Wii U is made obsolete by the Switch just on the porting aspect. Yeah, I get that certain things like Mario Maker maybe is a little bit smoother to create levels with on the gamepad and everything, and you can't do Nintendo Land and The other side of that, of course, is Star Fox Zero was just a mess, because like this is me when I'm trying to like play Star Fox Zero, and graphically it wasn't that great. And that's really the inherent problem with the Wii U, not just the Nintendo's failure to market it, not just the hubris that they had, thinking that they could continue the success that they had with the Wii, kind of what Sony felt going from the PS2 to the PS3, in my opinion. It was just overall failure that Nintendo had with the Wii U, and you could see that with all the third parties jumping ship real quick after its initial launch. Because its initial launch, oh, here's a Call of Duty game, here's Batman Arkham Asylum, here is a wholly new third-party game, Zombie U, and I feel like we're gonna sort of have a little bit of deja vu with the Switch 2, when that's going to start really gearing up, and we're going to see third party showing support with that. I'm hoping that we don't have repeating history, but sometimes history repeats with stuff. But yeah, Wii U, a solid C, and I would think Nintendo, you'd be grateful for that. The PlayStation 4, I'm going to be nice and give it a B. In my opinion, the PS4 is Sony's Charlie Brown system. It's that person that you played and and you just know them. They're just that's what they are. The system of Sony's that I feel has no identity. Everything that the PS4 does, the PS5 does better. The PS4 Pro does better. The PS5 Pro does better. And that's because now, with gaming since the 8th generation, everything is literally just iterative, computer-like devices. And that's, unfortunately, just kind of where we're at. The form factor with the PS4 is just kind of, it is what it is. Nothing really caught my eye. And then when the PS4 released, I remember going over to my buddy Bill's house. And of course, he had the PS4 right away because he had a little bit of money at the time, and it was like, oh, the PS4 release? I didn't know that was coming out. And he's like, yeah, and he had some racing game, might have been Gran Turismo or something that just okay, that's what it is. The graphics at the time they look good, but it wasn't anything that was like, oh my gosh, this is so great. And as the generation continued, you did have fantastic games such as the port of The Last of Us remastered, and of course you had Destiny, which was big at the time. And as the generation continued, you had a lot of games continue through to the PS5 era, and we continued to get PS4 games. I really feel like the PS4 is that know-nothing, identity-less console. It's good. It's like the thing that you can depend on, but it's not anything that's going to get you like really excited. Maybe it did for you guys. Let me know in the comments section below. Maybe I'm off my mark here. I would love to again start a dialogue with you guys. So now we're finally getting into the current generation, the 9th generation, and let's start off with the Nintendo Switch. Nintendo Switch easily is an S tier. Very, very close to being my favorite system of all time. That'd be the Super Nintendo, because what Nintendo has done is that they managed to merge all the worlds of the simplicity and the low processing power to balance the ability to have, okay mobile battery life, to also having enough power to have some pretty decent, and I'm saying decent, HD experiences. From its entry, and I mean, you want to talk about a baller year, 2017 for a first year for this release, you not only had Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, but you also had Super Mario Odyssey and other really fantastic releases. Then you've got the entirety of the Xenoblade saga, you got all the Bayonettas, you've got so many excellent remasters and remakes. I mean, you got Paper Mario, Super Mario RPG, and then you also have all the classic consoles coming back, the NES, SNES, even the Gameboy Color, Gameboy Advance. A lot of the offerings on the NSO really got pretty strong as the overall age of the Switch continued, and with that age, I know the last year or so really got heavy with remakes and remasters, but there are still some pretty decent evergreen new titles out, such as the Mario and Luigi Brothership and Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom. But really, the game library with the Nintendo Switch is phenomenal. From old ports to new games. I'm a big JRPG guy. Fantastic plethora of games in that genre alone. Again, it's not going to win any awards for the graphics, but again, that's not what Nintendo is all about. One of the things that I really enjoy with the Switch is the mobile capacity for it. I've done a lot of travel for my work, and the Switch is awesome to have, from being on the plane to finally when I get to the hotel room and I just need to like chill. I've got the Switch, and it has been such a fantastic companion for that. And that's kind of why I'm looking forward to the Switch 2, because again, it's continuing all that was good with the Nintendo Switch. One of the things that could be seen as a detractor, and okay, let's be honest, it is Joy-Con drift. Joy-Con drift is the biggest issue with the Nintendo Switch. I'm hoping the new Switch 2 gets rid of that. Hopefully that's not going to be an issue. I've heard that the Hall effect controls and joysticks and everything like that will make that a non-issue, but we'll just have to wait and see, as they say. Regardless, absolutely love what the Switch has done and its fantastic games library. It's one of the best. Speaking of one of the best, let's talk about the PlayStation 5. I give the PlayStation 5 an A. I feel it absolutely combats the issue that the PlayStation 4 has with that lack of identity console. When you see the PS5, you know what it is. It just by its aesthetics alone, it is a very unique looking system. And honestly, I was pretty impressed with the power increase and the what it can do strength-wise with all the games and just how well everything runs. And honestly, PS4 is obsolete. There's no need for it, simply because the PS5 plays like 99.9% of the entirety of the library of the PlayStation 4. So I don't like the direction of the later iterations of the system where they don't come with disk drives, and that's more an indictment of the gaming industry as a whole. I don't like that, but that's a whole nother discussion for another time. Regardless, I really have been impressed with the PS5. Pretty much everything except the games library. The games that have come out for it have been great, albeit they've lacked that sort of identity that really a lot of the previous generations of really all these consoles have had. There's no killer app for the PS5. Yeah, you could say God of War Ragnarok. Oh wait, isn't that on the PS4? Okay, well there's Horizon Forbidden West. Oh wait, that's on the PS4. The only one that's wholly, the only ones that are wholly unique are of course Ratchet and Clank and I think Returnal, and obviously Demon's Souls the remake, but again, that's a remake. And I think that's one of the issues with the PS5. That's why in my mind it doesn't get an S. I've really enjoyed my time with the PS5. I've played PlayStation more now than I ever have before. And honestly, that's more on me going through my own midlife gaming crisis in 2020 and deciding, hey, I want to play new experiences. I want new games. And the PS5, especially with the PlayStation Network having, some of the PS1 and PS2 games, that's been really great. And then the entire library, nearly the entire library of the PS4, also been great. Really enjoying my time. I feel Sony has earned an A on the PS5. Last one I'm going to go over is the Steam Deck. And y'all are going to think I'm crazy. You're going to think I'm crazy. I'm giving the Steam Deck an S. The biggest issue that I have with the Steam Deck is its battery life. That's it. The Steam Deck feels like, hey, this is a console, but you can do whatever the heck that you want with it. You can do whatever games, and I've literally done that with Shmemulation, as well as the entirety of your Steam library is on there. And I'm not a huge PC gamer, so my Steam library probably only has about maybe 100, 200 games on it. And 80 to 90% of them are playable and play well on the the Steam Deck. I love that. And I'm really looking forward to what Valve is going to be doing for the Steam Deck 2, the next iteration. These gaming PCs are really great. I've really enjoyed them, but it was obviously it was the Switch that sort of paved the path for that mobile type of gaming experience, which I'm glad that we're at a place where mobile gaming, and that was a big fear of ending video games as we know it in like the beginning to middle of the 8th generation. Glad that that's kind of gone off to the side, and we're at a place where, hey, mobile gaming is a thing, and if you want to dock it on a TV and play it on a TV, you can do that. I'm really grateful for that, and beyond the battery life, I really can't think of any other negatives with the Steam Deck. I don't have an issue with the large form factor. I've gotten used to it. Can't think of any negatives with Steam. I've really been enjoying my time with that. Been playing a lot of games that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to play thanks to Valve and that system. So that's my tier list. We've got the Super Nintendo, Nintendo Switch, Steam Deck, and the PS2 on the S tier. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. My nostalgia goggles really didn't taint the list, in my opinion. I was a little heavier on the positive grades in the beginning, but I was more with the positive grades also nearing the end as well. So that's my tier list. Again, let me know what you guys think. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.